Hi everyone, this is Nate Chakti, Education Specialist with the Watershed Alliance. We're here today to talk a little bit about the Watershed Model lesson and help our watershed educators get oriented to this piece of equipment here in front of us and how to deliver it to students. At this point, you should have laid out all of your props, know what each prop represents, and be familiar with the watershed model itself. As with any lesson, it's important as an instructor to introduce yourself and let students know sort of where you're coming from before you just jump right into the lesson. How I like to introduce this lesson, I'll start and say, so before we even touch this thing in front of us or start talking about this model, I want to introduce the concept of a watershed. And students, does anybody know what a watershed is? Some students might raise their hand, offer maybe bits and pieces of the definition, and then ultimately I'll lead students through just a really brief activity to introduce the concept of a watershed. So, if everyone could put their hands together like they're gonna scoop up some water out of the sink and wash their face. Imagine that you are holding the Lake Champlain watershed in your hands. Now your thumbs and the edges of your hands are the highest mountains around us, the Green Mountains in Vermont and the Adirondack Mountains in New York. All of the cracks and crevices in your hands are the rivers and streams, and where your hands meet is Lake Champlain. So all of this space, the hills, the cities, the towns, the mountains, the streams, the rivers, they're all a part of the Lake Champlain watershed. The purpose of our lesson today is to go through the different types of land use and understand what pollutants are coming from those places and how we can best manage them moving forward. Now that you have introduced the concept of a watershed, it's time to start diving in and talking about different land uses across the watershed and how they impact water quality. Now, the interactions between different land uses and our watershed and our water health are really complex, and it's important to point out to students that this activity isn't meant to single out or blame any particular facet of society. It's more of an opportunity to understand how they interact with one another and an opportunity to work together to implement some best management practices and take care of our watershed together. So I will really quickly, for students, just name each land use around the watershed before we get started. So I'll say, down here is our empty Lake Champlain. Here we have our farming or our agricultural center. We have our roadways, our transportation sector. We have our industry, our mountains, our public lands right here. We have our residential center. We have our wastewater treatment plant down here. And we have a construction site up here in the corner. Now that students are oriented to what a watershed is, all of the different land uses across our watershed, it's time to start honing in on each particular facet of our watershed and talking about what types of pollutants might be coming from each sector. This is a great time to ask for some student input in driving the direction of the lesson so they can take some ownership over our exploration of the watershed. So I'll ask students, where should we start? What land use do you all want to talk about first? For the purposes of this training video, we're going to discuss our agricultural center over here. What types of pollutants might originate here in our agricultural center? And students will throw out tons of ideas. We're going to go through each pollutant. One major thing coming from our agricultural center would be fertilizers. So you would have the student who said, oh, fertilizer, grab the fertilizer and pop it open and sprinkle some on. You can talk about why fertilizers are an issue. You can talk about runoff and eutrophication. All of these major vocab words and concepts are to be adjusted based on student understanding. So, for instance, you might not go in depth into the process of eutrophication with a group of fourth graders, but you would talk about blue-green algae. You might say, has anyone gone down to the beach on a hot sunny day, wanted to go swimming, and couldn't because there was algae blooms? In part, that's because of these fertilizers spread across our watershed. What else might we find on the farm? How about coming from those cows and pigs? Animal feces. So again, you can have a student sprinkle animal feces on our farm. Again, you can talk about, phosphorus and nitrogen runoff as a part of the fertilizers and the animal feces. You can also talk about bacteria. Another common pollutant found on our farm are pesticides and herbicides. So you can talk about the toxicity of these and how they can impact water quality. You can also talk about soil and loose sediment and the importance of cover cropping. You can talk about oil and gas and grease from poorly or improperly maintained equipment. For the rest of this video, we're going to jump around to the different land uses, and I'm going to give you a brief list of all of the different pollutants that you should be including in this watershed model discussion. We're not going to go in detail today into each different land use sector, but please take time on your own to familiarize yourself with each and the pollutants that might be coming from there. So next we have our industrial center here. Here you might find things like road salt in the parking lot. Our main consideration in the industrial center is our industrial waste. So at this point, I like to stop and talk about the difference between non-point source pollution and point source pollution. I often say that point source pollution you can point at. You can point right at a pipe sticking out into the river and see that waste coming into our waterways. Non-point source, like what you might find in our agricultural center, is less easy to determine where it's coming from. You can't point directly at the pipe where all of these different pollutants are entering the lake. We have our roadways, where you might find more road salt. You might find oil, gas, and grease. We have our deforested mountaintop, where you might find loose sediment and erosion taking place. We have our construction site, where again, you might find loose sediment and soil. You might find oil and gas from poorly maintained equipment. We have our residential center, where I like to point out that you might find a lot of the similar pollutants as on the farm. You'll find chemical fertilizers from people wanting nice green lawns. You might find pesticides and herbicides. You might find road salt to maintain walkways and roadways. You might find animal feces from people's pets. You might find yard waste and yard clippings. And again, oil and gas from folks' cars and automobiles and pickup trucks. The final thing we usually cover is the wastewater treatment plant. A lot of students won't be familiar with what a wastewater treatment plant is, so make sure to highlight why it's there, what it does, and mention combined sewer overflow events where raw sewage might be leaking into our waterway. Now that we have our pollutants spread throughout the different land uses and throughout our entire watershed, it's time for a little rainstorm and to watch as our pollutants flow through our rivers and our streams and into the lake. So you can take this spray bottle and pass it around to students and have each student spray the spray bottle 2 or 3 times. Make sure that they are pointing the spray bottle down at the watershed model like so, and not across it and spraying all of their friends on the other side of the table. So you can have them spray wherever they want, a few times. This is just a light drizzle throughout the basin. And you can start to see some of our pollutants are running off. And then as the instructor, you can unscrew the top and dump whatever's left. And this is our big torrential downpour. And you can see all of those pollutants flowing through our watershed down into the lake. Students will have a lot to say about this. No one wants to swim in that lake. It doesn't look very nice. We get our drinking water a lot of the times from Lake Champlain. That doesn't look very refreshing to me. Once you have had a short discussion about that, letting students react in whatever way they may, you can pull the plug on the lake, drain the lake, and get ready for part 2. Make sure students know that no, we cannot drain Lake Champlain, but what we can do moving forward is implement best management practices, which will be covered in part 2 of this video. As a side note, make sure that at the end of the watershed lesson, you're able to completely wipe down this watershed model, dump the bottom of our watershed model into a sink and rinse it off, wipe it down to the best of your abilities. And upon returning to the lab, thoroughly rinse and clean this watershed model and leave it out to dry.